I wish people like Tucker Carlson would do their homework before putting Mark Meckler on there and just letting him run with and believing everything Meckler has to say. You really need to study both sides of the issue. Or perhaps Tucker Carlson needs to have me on there as the counterpoint.
This is Christian Gomez with the New American Magazine. Joining us now to discuss Convention of States President Mark Meckler's interview on Fox Nation's Tucker Carlson today and the accuracy of Meckler's claims is constitutional expert and scholar Robert Brown. Mr. Brown volunteers his time speaking for the John Birch Society about the Constitution. He is well known for the 6-part lecture series, The Constitution is the Solution, which you can watch for free on jbs.org. Robert, thank you for joining us again here at the New American.
Oh, thank you, Christian. It's always good to be with you.
Thank you again. Yes, thank you so much. So in the interview, Tucker Carlson, of course, introduces Mark Meckler for having been one of the founders of the Tea Party organization of Tea Party Patriots. And in that capacity, Mark Meckler helped to awaken many Americans about the overgrowth of government that we saw with Obamacare in 2009, 2010, and so forth. And of course, we saw a big wave of a Tea Party, the Tea Party Congress, with Republicans taking over control there. So around the 9-10 minute mark of the interview, Meckler says that we saw the biggest wave in an election, and before they go into office, they began to be absorbed by the swamp. So what's your take on that part?
So this is an interesting little bit of history where, of course, we had this big sweep of new people going into Congress, all under Tea Party banner and things of that nature. And as he's telling his story, he talks about how he got frustrated because after they had this massive sweep, totally changed the makeup of Congress, that many of these people were beginning to be courted and controlled by the swamp, as he called it, even before they got into office. And very quickly, their voting records began to reflect that. And so he's kind of telling his story of frustration where he decided, maybe I'm done with politics. And then he goes into talk about how maybe he was then courted by Article 5 supporters and got into that movement. The first thing I want to point out here is that he totally missed the mark here. When it comes to changing Congress and getting new people into office, voting is not enough. That was good that we replaced people. But at the same time that he was doing that, this was around 2008, 2009, I went to Montana, hired by the John Birch Society to implement the power of 500. And we had an existing congressman. He did not get kicked out by the Tea Party wave, and his voting record was not very good. He was following the Constitution by the Freedom Index ratings anywhere from about 30% of the time to at one point he hit 67, but generally right around that half mark or less, half the time violating the Constitution. And in a matter of about 4 months, with about, I'd estimate about 200 people that we had across the state of Montana holding him to his oath of office, calling him on votes that were unconstitutional. In 4 months, he got an 80%. And while these other Tea Party congressmen were beginning to be more and more influenced by the swamp, our congressman in Montana continued to improve his voting record. He got up to a 90%, while so many others were beginning to really fall into the swamp that Meckler was concerned about. So just contrasting these two strategies, what we were doing in Montana is effective action in holding our congressmen accountable to the Constitution. And for more on that topic, I recommend the YouTube video, The Power of 500, where it goes into more detail of what we did and how we did it. But I want to take just a moment and talk about one of the things he concluded, just kind of get things out of order for just a moment. He concludes by talking about we're building the biggest, how do you put it here? The largest self-governing grassroots army in the history of the country. We have people in every single state legislative district in the United States of America. There are no exceptions. They often brag about having over 5 million activist supporters around the country. You do a little math, 5 million, that comes out to 11,500 people per congressional district as an average. How many did we use to get our congressmen to start following the Constitution? About 200. If they have over 11,000 per congressional district. We could enforce the Constitution now. So when Mark Meckler talks about getting frustrated that the people we elected didn't continue to do the job we sent them to do, they began to get absorbed by the swamp, the way he describes it. If they really are serious about restoring the Constitution, all they have to do is right now start sending out emails, phone calls, and messages to their 5 million activist supporters saying, let's start enforcing the Constitution now.
That's very interesting, because in that interview that that Tucker Carlson gave to Mark Meckler there, Mark Meckler said that we're not really involved in Congress. We don't really care about what they're doing. But if they have about 5 million supporters nationwide, in on average 435 congressional districts or so across the country, that's way more than what's needed to put the proper pressure to get Congress to actually obey the Constitution. That's negating the need for any new amendments or to change the Constitution.
And I think that's the problem that they have with this, is when we negate any need for a convention, we take away their movement. Of course, we take away Mark Meckler's. I think last we saw it, he's making about $500,000 a year. He's making some good money at this, but it takes away any excuse for changing the Constitution. I would refer to them as the blame the Constitution crowd. We're blaming the Constitution rather than blaming the people. We, the people, are the problem. We're the ones that are supposed to be, according to Hamilton, he says in Federalist 16, that the people are the natural guardians of the Constitution. And we failed at that. We have not been active in guarding the Constitution because we don't know the Constitution. And so this is a very simple prescription here. First of all, you have to identify what is the problem. They're not following the Constitution. Why are they not following the Constitution? Because we, the people, their voters, don't make them do so. We don't hold them accountable to it. When we did, like in Montana, our Congressman, Denny Rehberg, to his credit, he almost immediately changed his voting record and began following the Constitution, referred to us as his conscience, and thanked us for keeping him on track. They need to hear that from their people. We need to be standing up for the Constitution. And so when he talks about, hey, we have this team, we're building the largest activist support group, or as he called it, largest self-governing grassroots army, they've got that in place. Great. Why don't you use it? It reminds me of a lecture or presentation that was given by Robert Kelly in Boise, Idaho a few years ago. Robert Kelly was a Convention of States legal representation or whatever. And as he's giving this presentation saying why we need to change the Constitution, he says, well, someone from the audience asked him, Mr. Kelly, so when you get these amendments passed, what happens if they still don't follow it? And his answer was, well, we'll need millions of activists to enforce the changes. Well, follow-up question, Mr. Kelly, why don't we just do that now and skip the whole amendment process? And that's my question to Mark Meckler today. Why don't you do that now? Why don't we work together in enforcing the Constitution now? Because I've proven how that works. You just need enough people holding them accountable to the Constitution. So anyway, that's kind of the first place I wanted to go, was just this whole idea is based on a fraudulent claim that the Constitution's, they imply the Constitution's the problem rather than the solution.
The illustration there of Congressman Rehberg kind of leads us to our next point, which is that this is not a problem of personalities. I'm sorry, that this is not a structural problem inherent with changes that need to be made to the government, but rather it is a problem of personalities. Correct?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And this was around the 17 minutes into the interview there, where he says Michael Ferris came to me and was telling me what the real solution is. We don't have a personnel problem, we have a structural problem. Again, blaming the Constitution. But what they're saying, it was mostly from Supreme Court precedent and the 17th Amendment. These are the problems that have created a structural problem. And yet, I want to point out, what did we do about the Supreme Court precedent with Denny Rehberg? Did we change any Supreme Court decisions? Well, no, of course not. We expected him to enforce the Constitution as written, not as distorted and reinterpreted by the courts. And so he did. He started following the Constitution as written, regardless of Supreme Court decisions to the contrary.
So, speaking of distortions, also in the same interview later on, around the 19-minute mark, Mark Meckler, as he typically does, gives his version of what George Mason said during the convention. Can you just cover that real briefly?
Yeah, well, he always tells this. George Mason said, and then he's saying it as if it's this quote, none of which was actually said. George Mason simply points out that
Can you just what the
the
quote is first for those who are watching who may not be familiar with
yeah,
what we're
yeah,
discussing?
and I don't have the exact quote in front of me. I should have had that handy so I could give you the exact quote. But this is on September 15th, 1787, where they're talking about the the method for which they can make changes to the Constitution, the amendment process that they've written into the Constitution. And George Mason basically says that without the states having a way to originate amendments, no amendments of the proper kind will be able to be brought forward if Congress becomes abusive. And so, and what they're trying to say is they're trying to twist that into when Congress gets out of control and they're ignoring the Constitution, all that. It never says anything about that. It just simply says if Congress is abusive, then we should have a way the states can originate amendments as well. But George Mason also says that the Constitution will certainly have flaws, therefore amendments will be necessary. So he's talking about flaws in the Constitution being the reason for amendments. They try to twist that into if the federal government ignores the Constitution, if they're violating the Constitution, we should amend the Constitution. And interestingly, James Madison directly addresses that issue in Federalist 48 and 49. Federalist 49, he talks about, should we have an amendments convention for addressing or correcting, as he calls it, breaches to the Constitution? And he says how dangerous of an idea that is. He points out constitutions are merely parchment barriers, and as such, they cannot enforce themselves, and there's no way you can draw up. In fact, I do have some exact quote here on that. He says, Constitution is just a parchment barrier. Mere declarations in the written Constitution are not sufficient to restrain the several departments within their legal rights. So just changing the Constitution isn't going to solve anything, according to Madison. So their whole premise here, again, is a flawed idea that we can make changes to correct the structure as if the structure is a problem. No, this is a people problem. In fact, another brief story. On a speech tour a few years ago, I got to meet with Lieutenant Governor Tim Griffin in Arkansas. And as a former member of Congress, he says, you know what, I discovered Congress is actually very responsive to the will of their people, and I'd never suspected that. And then he uses the balanced budget topic as an example. He says, most people support the idea of a balanced budget, right? Does that mean Congress is not being responsive by not balancing the budget? No. It means that the people want a balanced budget, but they don't want it more. Then they want their federally funded programs and handouts and things of that nature. And the moment that changes, Congress will balance the budget overnight. The moment that becomes the top priority to the American people, and they're willing to give up all their federally funded programs. So when Mark Meckler is quoting Michael Ferris saying we have a structural problem, not a personnel problem, I would beg to differ. And apparently so would Tim Griffin, that we do have a people problem. The people, number one, don't understand the Constitution. And number two, we've become so addicted to government handouts that we want a balanced budget, but we don't want it balanced on our backs. We don't want it balanced on my federal programs that I enjoy or whatever.
And speaking of a balanced budget amendment, around also in the same interview, around the 20-minute, 30-second mark of that interview, Mark Meckler discusses how in 1982 there were about 32 states that had applied for a convention specifically to propose a balanced budget amendment, as you were discussing, to our Constitution. And Meckler says that at the time we had merely about $4 trillion of a deficit, and now it's $27 trillion later. So
national debt there, but
yeah. So playing devil's advocate a little bit here. So shouldn't we have a balanced budget amendment added to the Constitution, especially now considering how high the national deficit has increased since then? What is your take on what on Meckler's position there?
Yeah, and just for clarification, I often mix up the words, but to make it clear, our national debt was around $4 trillion, not the deficit. But of course, the deficit continuing to add to the national debt. But the point he's making here is deceptive, and I'm going to call this one out. Back in 1982, we were 2 states away from having enough applications for a convention. It takes 34 states applying for the convention. And he's implying that here we were at the time, $4 trillion in debt. Because they didn't have this convention back then, we're now 27 trillion deeper in debt. And one simple question, how many years, if that convention had passed the balanced budget amendment they were proposing, how many years since then would Congress have been required to balance the budget? Because one thing it has in there is it says we want an amendment that requires Congress to balance the budget in the absence of a national emergency. So how many years since 1982 have we had an absence of a national emergency and Congress would have been required to balance the budget? And the answer is 0.
Absolutely.
We have not had...
Just the following year, you have the shoot down of the flight with Congressman Larry McDonald on it, Korean Airline Flight 007. That would be already a national emergency. We cut off ties with the USSR. The Gulf-Persian War, Gaddafi's...
There's always an excuse for national emergency, and that's the point. Yeah,
the Taliban, USS Cole, 9/11.
I read an article recently showing that we've actually been under constant state of national emergency since 1979. And so even if they had passed this application and passed this amendment they were proposing back in 82, Congress would not have been required to balance the budget even once. It's a fraud. It's an absolute fraud. And yet Meckler throws that out there as if, had we done this, we should have done this, we wouldn't be in the debt we are. Actually, we would. It wouldn't have made any difference at all. But it could have caused deeper problems than what we have currently. So there's so much more to this than what he's putting out there that sounds good to the American people that don't know the details here. And this is just one thing that I wish people like Tucker Carlson would do their homework before putting Mark Meckler on there and just letting him run with and believing everything Meckler has to say. You really need to study both sides of the issue. Or perhaps Tucker Carlson needs to have me on there as the counterpoint, showing the other side of the argument, because there are two strong sides to this. And if you haven't done your homework, one side sounds pretty good until you hear the rest of the story here.
In around 21 minutes, 18 seconds in that interview, Mark Meckler says that the resolutions for a convention have to be almost identical in order to be aggregated.
And they say that until they don't. I'm going to pick on...
What do you mean by that?
In my own state, Utah, the lobbyist for Convention of States, who is also one of the biggest ones that pushed it through the state legislature, was the state legislator, Ken Ivory. And he, of course, was promising the state legislature that they have to be almost identical applications in order to add them together to get up to the total of 34. If they're not identical, you can't add them together, he claimed. And then just this last session in Utah State Legislature, he introduced a bill saying we're going to aggregate all kinds of amendment applications that have nothing to do with each other.
Ken Ivory is a key player at the Convention of States because he acted as the president for the Convention of States simulation or mock Article 5 convention that they had several years back.
That's right.
To sort of highlight this is how smoothly a Convention of States would look like. So he was the face of that convention in terms of being the president of the convention. And you're saying that he endorsed the COS resolution when it went through the Utah legislature, and just this past year, he's now advocating for aggregating all the convention applications, not just those for the balanced budget amendment from the 70s and 80s, but combining of those of different topics.
Correct. In fact, I think 2 of them that were included, specifically listed in his bill, saying we need to aggregate everything, included 2 applications for a convention for a Bill of Rights back in the late 1780s.
The New York and Virginia.
He's going to add those to Convention of States. Yeah, exactly. Add those to the Convention of States applications, some other balanced budget ones, some others totally on different topics. That he totally exposed his hand that you don't have to have the same topic. We can add anything together by that bill. It's just amazing reversal from the promises he had made to the state legislature that if we apply for a convention of a limited topic, we have all these, they can only be aggregated if they're on the same topic, and that will limit the convention to those topics. He's thrown all that out now, and now he's saying, let's throw them all together and aggregate everything so we can have a convention now.
But Convention of States, and Mark Meckler would say, if you read their application, what they want in part is a convention to limit the scope and jurisdiction of the federal government, add term limits to members of Congress.
Yeah.
And in fact, he even
Fiscal
reiterates this
restraints.
point at the 22-minute, 10-second mark of the interview, where he says that what they're seeking is limits on the scope and jurisdiction. So, what is your take on on Meckler stating that we just want to limit the federal government? That's the whole purpose of Convention of States.
Well, here's the problem with that. One of their 3 points is so wide open, I could pretty much fit any amendment proposal I wanted to, no matter how radical it was, to limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. That one is so broad, because that's what the Constitution already does. The Constitution already limits the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. And so a new amendment proposing new limits on the power and jurisdiction, are those new limits going to be higher or lower than the existing ones? And when they talk about we're going back to something like the enumerated powers, he's not saying we're going back to the enumerated powers. We're going to take the enumerated powers that are already in there and enforce them better. No, we're going back to something like them. So this, at every turn, it sounds like we're going to concede ground. We're not going back to the original Constitution, but we're going to try to take some steps in that direction, maybe. But with how broadly their convention application is worded, honestly, it would be difficult to have a runaway convention, because you can do just about anything. You can fit almost anything into their application. It's like the old saying of the way to eliminate all crime is to legalize everything, because now there's no crime. The same things are happening. It's just not called a crime anymore. In the same way, you can't have a runaway convention if you have such a broad convention application like Convention of States does, that I could justify virtually everything. Let's take, for example, power and jurisdiction of the federal government. The power and jurisdiction of the federal government regarding firearms shall be limited to. And then anything you say after that is germane to their application. It fits within the power and jurisdiction clause, including things like common sense gun control measures. That would now fit within the wording, technically, of their convention application. So you can talk about the power and jurisdiction of the federal government shall be limited to, raise their limits to whatever level you want, and it fits within their convention. There's nowhere to run away to.
And by Meckler stating that they want to go to something like the enumerated powers, that implies that it wouldn't be the enumerated powers. He's not going back to the original Constitution. So anything like the enumerated powers is likely not to be less powers for the federal government than what they have under the Constitution, but probably to give them a few more powers than what already is in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution.
Absolutely. If you look at where we are politically today, I always say if you were to pull up the anchor of the U.S. Constitution, drift to the center of political thought today, and reset the U.S. Constitution anchor there, will it be closer to the views of Marx or Madison? If we're going to reestablish some new enumerated powers, it's not going to be as conservative as the Madisonian Constitution of 1787. It's going to be far more liberal. It's going to be far more Marxist. There's just no question about that.
Absolutely. Unless every delegate was yourself or Thomas Massie. But that likely won't be the case. So
I'm sure Utah wouldn't select me.
Of course, Mark Meckler likes to say, and he did say, again, in this interview, that we've had lots of conventions in American history. 11 before 1787, he says, and over 30 since 1787. Is that any reassurance that an Article 5 convention today won't go out of hand? Or do those conventions have any bearings on the topic of Article 5?
I have to say he's missed thousands of conventions that have happened since then. I mean, there was a Tupperware convention last year. There was a national stamp collectors convention last year. There are all kinds of conventions happening all the time. And the reason I say that somewhat mockingly is that how many of those 11 before 1787, how many of those 30 since 1787 were national conventions for amending the national Constitution? Because that's the precedent we look to. It doesn't matter if there was a regional convention between a few states over water rights on a particular river they all share. That's not a national convention for amending the national Constitution. We've only ever had one convention on the national level that actually made changes to our national Constitution. That was 1787. So that's really the only one that is a precedent for having a national convention for creating new constitutional amendments. 1787. And on that topic, I use this term very carefully, but Mark Meckler blatantly lies about the historical precedent from 1787. There's just no question about it. I've had over a year and a half now, I've been offering a $10,000 challenge to anyone that can back his claims about what happened in 1787. The most key is where he says the 1787 convention delegates had all authority to do whatever they wanted to. In fact, he says the majority of their commissions from the states had this language in it. That's his exact words. And then he goes on to say, the commissioners shall have any and all authority necessary. So he says that language is in their commissions. And part of my $10,000 challenge is find even one commission from 1787 that had that language in it. He said it has that language in it. I would expect they would have that language in it. It's a blatant lie. So the historical precedent from 1787...
$10,000 is safe then.
It is, because I've read, you know what, there's 12 states that attended the convention. I've read all 12 of their commissions. None of them have that language in it. He made that up. Why did he make that up?
And of course, for those of you that are watching, you can read the original commissions on the article on the John Birch Society website, jbs.org, on the ConCon Action Tools page there. You have
That's right.
We have those available there as a PDF download, or anyone can read the words of the original 12 commissions from the 12 participating states. We're really running out of time now, but
I have one point I want to wrap up with then.
Okay, then. Okay.
Just kind of shortcut, because there's so much more in this interview we could get into. But there's one part in here that I think was probably the best part of the whole interview. I really liked this part. This is around 29 minutes, 29:50, somewhere in there is what I had as a timestamp, where he talks about Senator Coburn from Oklahoma did what he called an experimental basis. They built 1 mile of federal highway with no federal highway funds. He didn't call it federal highway, but one mile of highway without federal highway
1
funds.
mile of highway in Oklahoma.
Yes. And this was the experiment. And he said it was cheaper for Oklahoma building it without federal funds helping than building it with federal highway funds because of all the contingencies and all the stupid regulations and union rules that they have built in, that literally not taking the federal funding was cheaper for Oklahoma. There's a key here that I wanted to emphasize, and that is when you have states saying we need to push back against the federal government, maybe we need an Article 5 convention or whatever, we need some teeth to push back against the federal government's overreach. Here's where the teeth are. The majority of federally funded programs use the states to implement them. And in most cases, the various programs the states are wanting to do and they're using federal funding for it, it's cheaper for the states to not use the federal funding. And this was a great example of that. If the states are serious about saying, hey, we need the federal government to balance its budget, the states need to take responsibility for that by first declaring their own financial independence. Because no matter what state you're in, if your state legislators and your governors are saying our state is so financially incompetent that we can't provide for ourselves, that we cannot stand on our own 2 feet and provide for our own needs without federal funding, that should be offensive to you as a citizen of this, whatever state we're in. Every state, do you think the states could not financially survive if there wasn't a federal government funding them? Most states receive roughly half their budget from the federal government. And yet, as Mark Meckler pointed out, Tom Coburn made this as an example that is actually costing the states more, in most cases, to receive federal funding. We would be ahead financially if we shut off all federal funding and tried to run things as a state on our own. That would do so much to push back on federal government spending, for one, but federal control for another. If we start rejecting the federal funding and the strings that come with it. So this is just a little hint to what the real solution is. We talked about the power of 500. We talked about now the power of the states to say no. Nullification is part of that. Refusing federal funding is part of that. The states are complicit right now in the federal usurpation. And so when the states pretend to be powerless to stop, like Governor Abbott years ago was saying, we need an Article 5 convention because there are no teeth in the Constitution. There's no teeth in the 10th Amendment to push back by the states. You are the teeth. As a governor, as a state legislature, you are the teeth. Stop being complicit. That's my message I want to conclude on today. We already have the power. Meckler's organization already has the power right now to begin enforcing the Constitution, if that's what they intended to do. The states already have the power to push back against the federal government, if that's what they're really intending to do. We don't need to blame the Constitution, and we don't need to change the Constitution to accomplish that.
Well said, and thank you so much for your time. So take care, of course. God bless you in all your efforts to continue educating the American people about the Constitution. So thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Christian.
If Americans want to remain a free and sovereign nation, more people need to understand the principles and values that built this great nation. At the John Birch Society, we have the organization, the plan, and the resources to do just that. Our founder, Robert Welch, said, "Education is our total strategy and truth our only weapon." Go to jbs.org to learn more, including how you can get involved to work locally and impact nationally. Join the John Birch Society today.